The disappearance we are talking about today is a tragedy no matter how you look at it. When we first read about missing people, we usually automatically assume the most logical explanation was what happened. But what if you were wrong? This case might just surprise you. Let's talk about Claude and Sue Shelton. The research for this case was certainly not what I expected. There were only a few scant newspaper articles on the case, then nothing until 2009 when it got a short-lived boost of attention. I did request a police file from the Kentucky State Police via an open record search on this case, but it was declined. The reason given is it was part of an investigation that is still open. I was able to track down a close family member of the Sheltons, very close. What she would reveal in our conversations would surprise me. I am so grateful to her for opening up and telling me the story that has no doubt caused her so much pain. This case is a reminder to not believe everything you read. A lot of the information out there about this case, according to her, seems to be flat out incorrect. My information comes from someone who didn't just hear about it, she lived it. Life was quiet and seemingly uneventful for Claude and Martha Sue Shelton. Claude had worked as a mechanic at the Owens Tire and Muffler Company in Corbin for 10 years, while Sue stayed at home and looked after the children. They were the parents to Sheila 10, Ronnie 8, and Debbie 7. The family of 5 all lived together in their trailer at Jerry's Trailer Park on 18th Street in Corbin, Kentucky. Life was seemingly good until it wasn't. On Friday, May 28, 1971, after Claude got off work, the Shelton family had gone to see Claude's mother, Tempe Ellswick, in Williamsburg, Kentucky, only about 17 miles from Corbin. It was a nice visit and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They arrived back in Corbin that night after dark. The children were then tucked into bed. But what would happen overnight would change this young family forever. The Sheltons' oldest child, Sheila, had not yet fallen asleep. She heard her parents talking and was curious, so she listened closer to hear her father say to her mother something like, "If you're going with me, you better come on." The next morning, the children awoke to find something they didn't understand at all. Their parents were gone. Sometime that morning, Claude's boss at Owens had come to the trailer park to see why Claude wasn't at work. He normally worked a half a day on Saturdays. It is then that people were alerted to this bizarre scene and the police were called in to investigate. According to a newspaper article, the children were taken in briefly by friends of the couple until the school year concluded. Ultimately, Sue's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Conley Hunley, would come and get their 3 grandchildren and take them to their home in Knoxville. Police and really everyone who knew the Sheltons were shocked and had absolutely no idea where the couple could be. After hearing of the final words that Sheila overheard, it made even less sense. The couple had left the trailer in their 1967 two-door white Ford Galaxy 500, license plate Whitley County 937-944. Some reports say Sue's purse was left behind, while others say it wasn't. The couple, from what everyone could tell anyway, took no belongings with them on their late-night trip. There was an intensive search for the Corbins. The Civil Air Patrol Squadron and rescue squads from 4 towns searched the area. The Laurel River Lake was being created around that time and was a source for some of the searches. Even with all of the investigating and diligent effort by law enforcement, there was absolutely no trace of Claude and Sue Shelton or their car. The case grew cold very quickly. I was able to speak with a few townspeople of Corbin in my research. They were all exceptionally kind. I did speak to the owner of Jerry's Trailer Park, and she confirmed that the Sheltons only had 1 payment left on their trailer. Another person I spoke with that I especially want to thank is Marvin Craig. He worked with Claude Shelton for the entire 10 years he was at Owens, and the two were friends. He remembers Claude as a quiet but pleasant man, a perfectionist. Claude appeared to be devoted to his family and would speak of his young son often, Mr. Craig remembers. He also mentioned that when the Sheltons disappeared, Claude would have had 2 checks ready, salary and commission checks, as the company would pay the workers monthly. He also said that Claude also left behind about $3,000 worth of Duro brand tools. The amount listed is the value they would have been in 1971. This case would get a little more attention in 2009. Turns out that female remains that were found in Oregon in August of 1971 loosely resembled that of Sue Shelton. The female was initially referred to as Annie Doe. She remained unidentified for decades. Then when DNA testing became more available, police contacted Debbie and Sheila for a DNA sample to compare it to the unknown remains. This visit came just a few weeks after the daughters had lost their grandmother, Sue's mother, and it was hopeful that this was a sign that could lead to closure in their parents' disappearance. However, after DNA testing was complete, it was announced that the remains belonged to Annie Marie Lehman, a 16-year-old who had disappeared under troubling circumstances in Washington state in the winter or spring of 1971. Fast forward, the case is now over 50 years old. There has still been absolutely no trace of Claude and Sue Shelton. There continue to be sporadic searches in the water around Corbin. Adventures with Purpose and other dive teams even searched the area a few years ago. You can find the video on YouTube. Everyone is still completely mystified as to what happened to the couple. Here are the main theories. One theory is that the Sheltons may have accidentally driven in water nearby. As stated, the Laurel River Lake was being constructed from 1964 to 1974. It is listed as being 279 feet deep. If the couple did drive in the lake, they have never been found despite numerous searches there. Another theory mentioned is that the Sheltons met with foul play. It is not verified, but there were reports of an abandoned car with its hood up found in or near the town that night. It has even been mentioned that it might have been stolen. Again, no actual verification of this. This could mean that Claude, being a mechanic, may have stopped to assist the motorist and possibly met with violence that night along with his wife. Now I want to talk about who my main source is for this article. It is Debbie, the Sheltons' youngest daughter. Although only 7 when her parents vanished, she has been living with this mystery practically her entire life. Debbie does not think that the real story has been put out there and that no one has really cared over the years. I feel that it's time that the Sheltons' children's opinion should now be heard. First, let me correct the misinformation that the Shelton children say is out there. The date of the disappearance is reported as May 21st or 28th, but an official website says it was the latter date. Some places don't even get the children's age or sex right, but it was again Sheila, Ronnie, and Debbie. Sheila clarified once again recently she heard absolutely no mention of her father talking about going to King's truck stop that night, as is listed in many versions of this story. They are unsure where that came from, and the children say they were not in the habit of going there. They also say their parents did not have a jar of money they were saving up that reports say they took that night. As far as what the children think happened to their parents, well, that might surprise you. The Sheltons' children are adamant that their parents left simply because they wanted to. Debbie was already asleep that night, but Sheila, and possibly Ronnie, heard their father's words and were convinced from day one that they wanted to leave. Debbie wasn't told this by her siblings until she was in her 20s. She wasn't awake that night and didn't hear her father speaking. And at first was surprised, but the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like the most logical explanation. But of course, nothing is logical about this case. The Shelton children had chosen to keep their thoughts about this to themselves until now. Their parents were a subject that was rarely brought up over the years, even between themselves or other family members. They also wanted to protect their grandmother, Margaret Conley, who had raised them. They knew how painful it would be if she thought Sue had abandoned her own children. Sadly, she passed away on Mother's Day in 2009, mourning her daughter every day. With her grandmother gone, this is one of the reasons that Debbie felt comfortable in speaking with me about the disappearance. The Shelton family would go on to have more than its fair share of tragedy. Of Claude and Sue Shelton's 4 grandchildren, 3 of them have died at an early age. More recently, there was a bright spot for the family when Debbie and Ronnie got together with a group of their cousins from the Shelton side in early October of 2021. It was a bonding time for the cousins, and they planned to stay in touch. Sadly, another tragedy was on the horizon as Ronnie Shelton, Claude and Sue's only son, would suddenly die from a heart attack just a few weeks later in October of 2021. He was only 58 years old. As far as my thoughts on this case, I'm really not completely convinced either way, to be quite honest. I have a hard time believing that the Sheltons, who had lived in Corbin for many years, would be unfamiliar with the area and accidentally drive into the water. The foul play aspect is certainly a possibility, but again, I'm a bit surprised that no trace of them or their car has ever been found in 50 years with countless searches. As far as them leaving their children, at first we think no one would ever be capable of that. No reports of any abuse or mistreatment of their children were ever reported. Everyone had only kind things to say about Claude and Sue, and everyone I spoke to thought they were truly devoted parents. But their actions that night just don't make sense. They spend the night with their children visiting Claude's parents, get home late, tuck them into bed, and shortly after just leave? What would possibly be the reason? If it was to run a quick errand, why wouldn't they have done it with the children before they got home that night? The children say they had never left them home late at night before. It also sounds like by what the oldest daughter heard her father say, that it was at least somewhat prearranged, meaning they didn't just decide last minute to go. He didn't have to explain to Sue what he was referring to. It was apparent by what the children claimed they heard that she knew what he was talking about. Debbie believes they may have left overnight to get a head start in wherever they were going, meaning they wouldn't be discovered missing for many hours. She also wonders if the trip to their grandmother's that night had a dual purpose, and that was so their father could see his mother one last time before he left. I also want to mention that it would have been easier to disappear if you wanted to in 1971 than it would be today. Even though the children never saw any jar with money collected, this information was given by a witness, it is possible it existed and was hidden. If it was there and was taken that night, it might bolster the theory that the couple had a plan to leave their life behind and brought the money with them to assist that. I will mention an interesting email I recently received that someone sent me after reading my original article on this disappearance. This person asked their mother and grandmother their thoughts on the disappearance. They remarked that back then it would have been easy to start a new life in Alaska. In the 1970s, they were giving land away there to help populate the area. Her mother also told her back then you could drive through Canada without any problems. Her family member received land in Alaska around that time, and they don't even remember having to give any form of identification. Of course, nothing at all pointing towards the Sheltons being in Alaska. I just wanted to point out an example of how easy it would have been to go off the grid and stay off during that time. I've also been thinking more recently, perhaps the Sheltons were involved in something secretive that they didn't want anyone to know about. Their intention could have been to go somewhere or meet with someone late at night so no one would know what they were doing. Is it possible that the Sheltons that night planned to run a secretive errand or clandestine meeting of some kind and fell prey to an accident or foul play? I certainly can't rule it out. I believe what the children heard that night was correct, and that was that their parents intended to leave in the middle of the night for whatever reason. The biggest questions are what they were doing and did they plan on coming back? Another thing that struck me when I spoke to Debbie in my research for my article and now podcast is the children's opinion on this. Meaning the children would normally be the first people to insist their parents wouldn't leave them and never come back, but it seems that right away the two children who heard their father's words were convinced immediately of what actually happened that night. Since Debbie didn't find out her siblings' thoughts and what they heard that night, she lived in fear. She told me she worried that whoever took her parents would do the same to her. I've also wondered if perhaps the Sheltons and their vehicle could be in the water somewhere, just not Laurel River Lake, which has been searched several times for them. I certainly hope searches will continue to try to get the Sheltons' surviving children some answers. Now let's talk about who we know are the true victims of this disappearance. Sheila, Ronnie, and Debbie Shelton. Imagine having an enjoyable night at your grandparents' house, looking forward to a carefree summer, then wake up one morning and you're basically an orphan. Not knowing whether your parents were injured, dead, or just decided to leave you. I mean, which scenario is the best one? They are all horrible possibilities that these children have had to live with for over 50 years. Now there are only 2 of them left to wonder. As you can understand, it's easier for them to just put it out of their head. They did all go on to live happy and productive lives, despite the profound sadness of their childhood. This case is a perfect example of why I choose to talk about these more obscure cases. As I say at the end of every podcast, cold cases grow cold because their story stops getting told, and that is so true. Without finding some evidence of the Sheltons and their car, or evidence that they existed past 1971, we will never truly know that whether that night was an accident or abandoned. That concludes my podcast on Claude and Sue Shelton. If you enjoyed listening, please leave me a rating or review on where you listen to your podcast. You can find me, Lost and Found Podcast, one word, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. I try to release a new episode every 2 weeks. You can also read all of my original articles, as well as links to my most recent podcasts, on my website at Lost and Found Blogs. I also now have a Patreon page titled Lost and Found Podcast, and have some exclusive content on there about obscure missing persons cases that you probably have never heard of. I also have Lost and Found blog pages on Facebook, Instagram, and X. You can reach me by email at lostandfoundpodcast@yahoo. And remember that cold cases stay cold because their story stops getting told.